Hey, I'm Joe, and today I want to talk to you about how you can edit your videos faster. I've been editing video professionally for the last 8 years. For the first 2 years of that, I was in Final Cut Pro 7, and then we transitioned to Premiere, and I've been working in Premiere Pro ever since. The tips that I want to talk to you about today and how you can edit your videos faster really apply to any professional level editing software, and a lot of them will apply to any editing software, period. One thing I find with a lot of new editors or editors that aren't used to working with a team is that they don't organize their projects in a very consistent and a uniform manner. This isn't that big of a problem for folks when they think that they're the only one that's going to be touching the project, or that they're going to get the project done and they're never going to come back to it and adjust anything or make any changes or pull footage forward or anything like that. Especially if you're editing in a professional setting, being able to keep your projects buttoned down and know where everything is and where it should be based on how you set up every project that you touch makes the process so much easier. You don't have to go relinking files from 4 different hard drives. You don't have to worry about something being in your downloads folder and it's unlinked and you deleted your downloads folder, so now you don't even have the asset anymore. All of those problems get eliminated if you just organize your files consistently. And even if you don't have to come back to your edits, it will speed up your process in editing because you'll know what you're looking for and you'll know where it is. So let's take a look at how I set up my projects. When I'm setting up a project on my hard drive, I will label the master folder with whatever the project is. If it's my day job, this might mean it gets associated with a project number or a client name and a project title. If it's my personal or freelance projects, typically I would label it with the client name and the project name and then some kind of a loose date like January 2021 or something like that. Once I have that master project folder set up, I create a bunch of subfolders. This is how I keep things organized and delineated so I know on a glance here's where the things are that I'm looking for. So I have subfolders for my After Effects files, I have subfolders for my Premiere file, I have a subfolder for my footage, I have a subfolder for graphics and assets and sound effects and music, and it just helps me know at a glance if I'm looking for this, this is where it should be. I'll even go so far once I get into a project, if I have music tracks that are unlicensed, I might have a subfolder that contains the unlicensed music tracks so that I know when I'm going in to finalize a project, these are the unlicensed ones. I need to have a folder for licensed tracks so that I know I'm pulling the right one and linking to the right file in the final edit, so it is the right licensed piece of music. Usually once the project's done, I'll get rid of that, but it just helps me keep it clean and separate and know which is which. Another way that I kind of break this down even further is in my footage folder. So typically within my footage folder, I would at least have a folder for my B-roll and a folder for any talking head footage or interviews. This is going to change depending on the scope and the nature of the project. For example, if I have like a multi-day event video that I'm shooting, I might have a footage folder, and then within that I might have day 1, day 2, day 3, and within those folders I might have B-roll folder, a time-lapse folder, an interview folder, and depending on how many interviews I have, I might break my interviews down by name and say this is Josh's interview, this is Julie's interview, this is so-and-so. That just helps me stay super clean and quick if I know how I want to break this apart. Then if I want to work on the interviews and somebody says, hey, let's go back and look at Julie's footage, I know exactly where to go and grab it. It's right there. I know it was from day 1. It just makes the project so much easier to navigate. To take that even one step further, if you're on a multicam shoot, typically I would break it down between cameras. So if it's a multi-day, multi-camera shoot, I might have day 1 Canon 80D, and then within that, footage from that Canon 80D. I may have a folder for a GoPro if I'm doing time-lapse or like action type shots with a GoPro, and then within that it would say time-lapse. I've done a bunch of different week-long event type videos in the past, and going through, you're talking hours and hours and hours of footage. Organization is clutch for an editor, and it is something that I just try to get better and better at every year because it is critical in keeping your projects workable, and just making the whole process easier and more enjoyable, and in the end faster because you know where you're going. So the second tip that I have for you today on how to make your editing workflow go faster is something that I picked up at an editing workshop that I went to in Nashville, Tennessee several years ago. The individual leading the workshop was actually the editor for the Saturday Night Live film unit. I'm not sure if he's still the one working there today, but I remember watching through a lot of his work and being amazed at kind of the quality, but also the speed of the timeline that they have to turn that work around since it's a weekly show. I was a fairly young editor at the time and early in my career, and I still use the toolbar for the vast majority of the processes in the timeline. And one of the biggest things that I took away from this workshop was to use the hotkeys for whatever software I'm in and customizing them in some cases. I remember listening to this guy say, if you're using the razor tool, you need to stop right now, and completely shaming anybody in the room that was still using that. And I remember just sinking back in my chair and being like, I don't use the razor tool. You use the razor tool. I promise you, if you are not using hotkeys, you are wasting so much time in your software. What he talked about was setting up your hotkeys in a way that keeps your hands essentially on the keyboard or on the mouse at all times. So you don't have to move anything. You can perform almost every editing process from one spot. You stay way more efficient. You can navigate the timeline as a breeze. So I'm gonna dive deep here into some of the top hotkeys that I use. These should be able to be set as custom in most editing softwares. I know they are in Final Cut. I know they are in Adobe Premiere Pro. So let's take a look. The first one, and probably the most obvious, is the Add Edit tool. The Add Edit tool just creates an edit on the timeline wherever your playhead happens to be at the time. For me, I've set this key up custom as Shift+E on the keyboard. So if I hold down the Shift key and hit E, it's gonna add an edit anywhere on the timeline where my playhead is. From there, one of the next ones that I use a lot is Shift+X, and that deletes anything in the timeline that I have highlighted at the time. So if I have a clip that I just cut out and I want to get rid of it, I can select it, Shift+X, delete. Hand never comes off the keyboard, hand never comes off the mouse. Another one that gets used all the time for me is Shift+C. This is a ripple delete. So if I want to make an edit, say I say something redundant in an edit like this, and I want to remove it, I will come in, I will add an edit, select the clip that I want to take out, ripple delete it, shorten the sentence. You can take out that redundancy or whatever it is that you don't want to say, and that ripple delete will close your timeline up and you're on your merry way. Another set of hotkeys that are kind of all related that I use all the time are zooming in on the timeline, zooming out on the timeline, and zooming to fit the timeline. So for me, zooming in on the timeline is Shift+A. If I want to zoom out, I'll hold Shift+Q. And this is in just increments. It zooms in, I don't know what it is, if it's like 10%, but it zooms in increments so that you can zoom into whatever it is you're trying to look at. And it zooms in around the playhead. So wherever the playhead is in the timeline, it's going to zoom in to that place. One I use all the time if I'm zoomed in on a project and I want to kind of come back out and see the whole edit is Shift+Z, and this basically zooms to fit the timeline. However long your edit is, it will fit it to the width of the timeline on your monitor. I use this absolutely all the time in my edits, and it is super handy for navigating through the sequence. These last few hotkeys don't get used all the time, but when I do need them, they are pretty handy. The first one is applying a default transition. For me, this is set up as Shift+T. This, for me, is a cross-dissolve transition. It's a cross-dissolve on video layers, and it's like a continuous power or something like that on audio layers. And what I use it for probably most often is if I want to fade a clip out to black, or I want to like soften the audio on my audio track. Sometimes if I'm cutting two pieces of audio together in an interview, I will apply this transition and then drag it down to be really short so that it just takes that hard edge off of the audio so it's not such an obvious cut. Every now and again I'll use this transition to fade text up on screen if I'm adding a text layer within Premiere. It's just handy to have it there as a default transition when you need it. That way you don't have to go to your effects panel, you don't have to drag it onto a clip. You just select the end of the clip, Shift-T, it's applied. Another one that I don't use all the time, but I do use pretty regularly for interviews, is a quick labeling hotkey for my clips. So typically in Premiere, your clips come in as like this blue track. And when I'm editing interviews, sometimes I'll have 30, 45 minutes of footage, and I don't want to delete out the stuff that I don't want to use necessarily, because sometimes it will tie into a good clip, but I do want to isolate the sound bites or the pieces of information that I'm fairly confident will fit the story or that seem like really compelling pieces of an interview. So when I'm doing this and I'm trying to pull these selects, I'll make an edit on one end, I'll make an edit on the other end, and then I'll select that clip and I will hit Shift R, and that will take the highlighted clip and turn that section purple to label that clip, and that way I know any purple clips that I see in this interview timeline are selects, the ideal pieces of info that I think could come together to tell an interesting story in that interview. So that is probably 90% of the hotkeys that I use in my editing workflow. It's certainly all of the ones that get used every time I jump in to edit a project, and it has absolutely changed the game on how fast I'm able to work through an edit. I think if you don't use hotkeys like this and you implement these, it will probably at least double your speed in edits. It will take some time to get used to using these if you haven't been using hotkeys. So please give yourself some time to get used to it and get in a flow of working with this kind of process. But I promise you, if you get used to this and you start using these all the time, it will absolutely make you a faster editor. So that's what I've got for you. I hope that that was valuable to you if you're an editor. I encourage you all to try these out when you're creating your projects. Work on your organization, figure out a system that works for you to keep your files consistent and organized, set up some custom hotkeys. This by no means is the only way to be efficient and fast as an editor. It's just the way that has worked the best for me, and I'm sure that there are those of you out there that have great tips to offer. So drop those down in the comments if you have them. Let me know on Instagram if you have input there, and I will see you guys on the next one.